The air in the grand ballroom of the Corinthian Hotel was a suffocating cocktail of money and magnolias. It clung to the back of Zariah Monroe's throat, thick with the scents of a dozen competing perfumes and the low, self-satisfied hum of 1,000 conversations. She moved through the glittering archipelagos of guests, a ghost in a starched black uniform, her tray of champagne flutes a silver shield. Each glass was a tiny, distorted mirror, reflecting a world she served but could never enter. The polished marble floor threw back warped images of crystal chandeliers, each one dripping light like a weeping willow made of diamonds. It was a disorienting, dazzling prison. Tonight was the Stratus Tech Annual Gala, a celebration of innovation that felt, to Zariah, more like a coronation. At the center of it all stood Magnus Sterling, the company's enigmatic CEO. He was a man carved from glacial ice and stock options, his posture an unwavering column of power. He didn't mingle, he held court. People orbited him, their laughter a little too loud, their nods a little too eager. Zariah's focus was singular: keep the glasses full, keep her head down, keep moving. Invisibility was a skill she had perfected over years of service jobs, a form of armor. She could navigate a room of 100 people and leave no trace, her presence as fleeting as the foam on the champagne. It was a quiet, weary superpower. She was circling a cluster of investors discussing market caps when a hand shot out, not to take a glass, but to stop her. Zariah froze, her balance shifting almost imperceptibly. Another. A voice clipped. The word, not a request, but a command. The man didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on Magnus Sterling across the room. He was Julian Thorne, CEO of Nexus Innovations, Stratus Tech's chief rival. He was handsome in the way of a polished weapon, sharp jaw, predatory smile, and eyes that assessed everyone for their value or their threat. He held out his empty flute, his knuckles white. Zariah's training kicked in. She reached for a fresh glass from her tray, her movements fluid and practiced. But as she pivoted, a guest jostled her from behind. It was a tiny, accidental bump, but it was enough. The tray tilted. A single, perfect drop of golden champagne arced through the air and landed on the pristine white cuff of Julian Thorne's shirt. The world seemed to slow down. The hum of the room didn't stop, but a pocket of silence instantly formed around them. Julian Thorne looked down at the tiny, spreading stain as if it were a mortal wound. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze, and finally, truly, looked at Zariah. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression of placid, chilling disgust. He held up his wrist, displaying the soiled cuff for the small, silent audience that had now gathered. "It's fascinating," he said, his voice a silken blade that cut through the air. He wasn't loud, but his every word demanded attention. "It truly is. What passes for service these days?" He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every eye in their immediate vicinity fix on Zariah. She could feel the heat on her cheeks, the frantic pounding of her heart against her ribs. She stood perfectly still, her tray held steady. "Some people," Julian continued, his gaze sweeping over her uniform, her tightly braided hair, her face, simply aren't suited for certain environments. It requires a particular finesse, a level of attention that is, perhaps, beyond the grasp of some. The insult was a masterpiece of coded cruelty. He hadn't called her clumsy. He hadn't called her incompetent. He had, with the cool precision of a surgeon, dissected her very presence and declared it unworthy. He had made her not just a server, but a contaminant in his rarefied air. The people around them shifted uncomfortably. A few offered thin, nervous smiles, but no one spoke. No one defended her. In this world, a stained cuff on a man like Julian Thorne was a greater offense than a shattered spirit. Zariah opened her mouth to offer the trained, placating apology her job required. "I'm so sorry. Sir, let me get you a cloth." But the words caught in her throat. The cloying scent of his cologne, a sharp, woody fragrance like cedar and ash, hit her. And suddenly, she wasn't in the Corinthian hotel anymore. She was 10 years old, standing in the cramped, dusty office of a downtown landlord. The air smelled of old paper and the same sharp, woody scent from a cheap air freshener plugged into the wall. Her grandmother, Naomi, stood before the landlord's desk, her hands moving with quiet, desperate urgency. She was signing, explaining that the rent would be late because her sewing machine had broken. Her main source of income. The landlord, a heavy man with a bored expression, stared at her moving hands with open contempt. He hadn't understood a word. He hadn't tried. He'd simply looked at Naomi, then at Zariah, and said, his voice dripping with condescension, "People like you need to understand your place. This isn't a charity. People like you." The memory slammed into Zariah with the force of a physical blow. The shame, the helplessness, the burning injustice of it all. Her grandmother, a woman of immense grace and strength, reduced to a problem, a nuisance, an inferior. Zariah blinked, and the ballroom swam back into focus. Julian Thorne was still watching her, a smug, expectant look on his face. He was waiting for her to crumble, to stammer an apology, to shrink. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The years of practiced invisibility, of swallowing pride, of smiling through gritted teeth, it all fell away. She looked Julian Thorne directly in the eye. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear and resonant. A perfect, polished stone dropped into a silent pool. A single drop. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone even and calm. "Hardly a crisis. But if it will help, I'd be happy to show you how to use a club soda and a napkin. It's a useful skill for anyone, regardless of their environment." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the onlookers. Julian Thorne's placid mask finally cracked. A flicker of genuine shock, then fury, crossed his features. He had expected a mouse, and he had found a lioness. She didn't wait for his response. With a poise that felt both innate and hard-won, she turned, placed her tray on a nearby table, and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She simply exited the scene, leaving a stunned billionaire and a room full of whispers in her wake. She could feel his eyes burning into her back, a promise of retribution. The ghost in the uniform had just shown her face, and, in doing so, she had declared a war she didn't even know she was prepared to fight. The next morning, Zariah's apartment felt smaller than usual, the silence pressing in on her. The small framed photograph of her grandmother on the kitchen counter seemed to watch her with knowing eyes. Naomi Monroe had been deaf since birth, a fact the world treated as a deficiency. But to Zariah, her grandmother's silence was a language. It was in the patient way she threaded a needle, the expressive dance of her hands as she told stories, the deep, rumbling laugh that shook her whole body without making a sound. Naomi had taught Zariah that strength wasn't about being the loudest person in the room. It was about holding your ground when the world tried to silence you. Zariah had been trying to hold her ground her entire life. Growing up in the Ninth Ward, she learned early that the world was divided into rooms you were allowed into and rooms you weren't. Education was supposed to be the key. She'd studied relentlessly, her brilliance a quiet, fierce rebellion against circumstance. She'd earned a full scholarship to MIT, a ticket to a different world. For a year and a half, she'd thrived, diving into linguistics and artificial intelligence. Fascinated by the architecture of communication, she dreamed of designing systems that could bridge worlds, just as she had always done for her grandmother. Then, the call came. A sudden illness. A rapid decline. Zariah left MIT without a second thought, trading lecture halls and coding labs for hospital waiting rooms and, eventually, the hollowed-out silence of the apartment without Naomi in it. The scholarship vanished. The dream was put on hold. Survival became the new curriculum. She took jobs waitressing, tutoring, stocking shelves, each one a step further away from the future she had planned. But a necessary step to keep the lights on. The Bellevue Regency, and now the Corinthian Hotel, were just the latest stops on a detour that had become her life. Her shift that evening was thick with tension. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Mr. Davies, called her into his office before she even clocked in. He didn't offer her a seat. "I got a call this morning, Zariah," he said, avoiding her eyes. "From Julian Thorne's office. He was displeased." "He was rude," Zariah countered, her voice calm. "He publicly humiliated me." "He's a platinum-level client. You're a temporary staff member." Mr. Davies sighed, rubbing his temples. "Do you see the imbalance here? He wants you fired." Zariah's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression neutral. For what? For not letting him insult me. For insubordination. For creating a scene. He finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. "Look, I'm not going to fire you. But you're on thin ice. Stay away from Thorne. Stay away from any of the VIPs. Just be invisible. Can you do that?" It was the one thing she was tired of being, but she nodded, because rent was due. The gala was still in full swing, a multi-day affair for the tech elite. That night's event was a more intimate cocktail reception on the hotel's rooftop terrace. Zariah was assigned to the service bar at the far end, a safe distance from the power players. From her vantage point, she could see the city lights twinkling below, a galaxy of possibilities that felt a million miles away. She saw Magnus Sterling arrive, this time with his mother, Margot, in a wheelchair. Margot Sterling was an elegant woman with silver hair and eyes that held a gentle, observant light. Zariah had heard whispers about her. She was a brilliant artist who had lost her hearing in her youth. Now, in a world her son was so intent on revolutionizing with technology, she was often left on the sidelines, an analog relic in a digital age. Guests would approach her, smile too brightly, shout a few pleasantries as if volume could bridge the gap, and then retreat, their social duty done. Zariah watched as Margot's hands would occasionally lift, forming a tentative sign, a question, a thought, only to let them fall back into her lap when she received no response. It was a quiet, heartbreaking pantomime of isolation. The scene pricked at the raw memory of her grandmother. Naomi had faced a lifetime of such moments, of people who saw her silence and assumed an absence of thought, an absence of worth. Later in the evening, as Zariah was clearing glasses near the terrace railing, she saw Margot Sterling trying to get the attention of a server. Her hands were moving, signing the word for water. The server, a young man Zariah didn't know, just smiled nervously and shrugged, then turned to take a drink order from someone else. Margot's face fell, a subtle but profound expression of defeat. Mr. Davies's warning echoed in Zariah's mind. Be invisible. But Naomi's voice, the one she heard in her heart, was stronger. You do not shrink to make others comfortable. Zariah put down her tray. She walked over to Margot Sterling's table, her heart pounding a steady, defiant rhythm. She knelt, making sure she was at eye level. She didn't speak. Instead, she lifted her hands. "Hello," she signed, her movements crisp and clear. "My name is Zariah. Can I help you?" Margot Sterling froze. Her eyes, which had been clouded with resignation, widened in stunned disbelief. Then, a slow, radiant smile spread across her face. Her hands flew up, a sudden joyful burst of communication that had been dammed up all evening. "You signed?" Margot's hands danced. "Oh, my goodness. I haven't had a real conversation all night. I was just trying to ask for some water, and maybe to know where the loveliest restrooms are located." She had a quick, witty style of signing, her expressions animated and full of humor. Zariah smiled back, her own relief a palpable thing. "The water is no problem at all, and the best restrooms are on the mezzanine level. They have much better lighting." Their hands moved in a silent, fluid dialogue. For those few minutes, the rooftop terrace, with its clinking glasses and forced laughter, faded away. It was just the two of them, speaking a language built on seeing, not hearing. They talked about the view, about the oppressive humidity of the city, about Margot's recent art exhibit. A phone camera flashed. Then another. Someone had noticed. The quiet conversation between a billionaire's mother and a uniformed waitress was suddenly a spectacle. A small crowd began to form a curious, whispering circle around them. Across the terrace, Magnus Sterling turned. His conversation with a group of venture capitalists faltered as he saw his mother, not isolated and withdrawn, but animated, laughing, her hands a blur of motion as she conversed with Zariah. His usual stoic expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on the scene with an unnerving intensity. He watched as Zariah concluded her conversation with a respectful nod. Signed, "It was a pleasure to meet you," and rose to fetch Margot's water. Before Zariah could walk away, Magnus was there. He moved with a quiet, imposing economy of motion. "Thank you," he said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of emotion. Yet, it commanded the space around him. "I was just doing my job," Zariah replied, her gaze steady. "No," Magnus corrected her, his eyes searching her face. You were being human. What's your name?" "Zariah Monroe." He nodded slowly, the name seeming to settle in his mind. He didn't say another word, just turned back to his mother, who was still beaming. But Zariah knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that her brief, beautiful moment of connection had once again made her dangerously visible. She had helped one Sterling, and, in the process, had likely drawn the renewed, vengeful attention of Julian Thorne, who stood watching from the shadows of the bar, his face a mask of cold fury. The video clip was 30 seconds of silent, powerful theater, filmed on a guest's phone. It showed Zariah kneeling, her hands moving with graceful precision, and Margot Sterling's face transforming from loneliness to radiant joy. By the next afternoon, it was everywhere. It had a hashtag, the language of kindness. News outlets picked it up, framing it as a heartwarming story of human connection in an age of digital detachment. Zariah Monroe was no longer an anonymous server. She was the signing waitress, a symbol of empathy. For Zariah, the viral fame was a bizarre and unwelcome storm. Her phone buzzed with notifications from strangers praising her, from deaf advocacy groups thanking her, from journalists wanting an interview. At work, the atmosphere was a mix of awe and resentment. Some co-workers saw her as a hero. Others whispered that she'd orchestrated the moment for attention. Mr. Davies just looked at her with the weary expression of a man whose life had become unnecessarily complicated. 2 days after the gala, A black town car pulled up outside her apartment building. A man in a sharp suit knocked on her door and handed her an envelope. Inside was a simple, embossed card, Ms. Monroe. My mother and I would be grateful if you would join us for lunch. A car will be waiting for you tomorrow at noon. Magnus Sterling. There was no phone number, no way to decline. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. The lunch was at a private club so exclusive, it didn't have a sign. Zariah, dressed in the nicest blazer she owned, felt a fresh wave of imposter syndrome wash over her as she was led to a quiet table in a sun-drenched atrium. Magnus and Margot were already there. Zariah, thank you for coming. Margot signed, her smile genuine. Magnus translated, though Zariah was already reading her hands. The conversation was surprisingly easy. Margot was warm and curious, asking about Zariah's grandmother and her passion for ASL. Magnus was reserved, but he listened with an intensity that made Zariah feel truly heard. He asked about her time at MIT, about the projects she had dreamed of creating. For the first time in years, she spoke about her ambitions, not just the cafe, but her ideas for accessibility tech, for creating systems that didn't treat disability as an afterthought. As the meal ended, Magnus leaned forward, his expression serious. Zariah, what you did for my mother was more than just kind. You provided a bridge. Stratus Tech is supposed to be in the business of connection, but we've failed to connect with entire communities. Your perspective is valuable. He slid a folder across the table. This is a proposal. Stratus Tech has a community investment fund. We seed innovative, mission-driven startups. I want you to lead a new project. We'll provide the capital, the resources, the team. You provide the vision. Zariah stared at the folder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She opened it. The title on the first page read, The Monroe Initiative, a proposal for inclusive spaces. It was her cafe dream, not just sketched out, but amplified, professionalized, with market analysis and a 5-year growth plan. It was everything she had ever wanted, handed to her on a silver platter. Why, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Because talent should be nurtured, not left to serve champagne at galas. Magnus said simply, and because my mother likes you. That's a rare endorsement. The offer was a lifeline, a miracle, but as Zariah drove home in the silent, plush interior of the town car, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. The world wasn't a fairy tale. Benefactors were rarely simple, and she knew, with a cold, sinking feeling, that Julian Thorne would not see this as a heartwarming story of a young woman getting her break. He would see it as a direct escalation of the war she had unwittingly started. By accepting Magnus Sterling's help, she was now officially a player in a game between two titans, and she was standing on Magnus's side of the board. The news of the Monroe Initiative sent a shockwave through the tech community. Stratus Tech, a behemoth known for cloud computing and enterprise software, was funding a chain of accessible first cafes. It was an odd, headline-grabbing move, and at the center of it was Zariah. She was given an office on the 48th floor of the Stratus Tech Tower, a space of sterile, minimalist beauty with a view that stretched to the horizon. She had a team of analysts, designers, and project managers at her disposal. The transition was dizzying. One week she was wiping down sticky tables. The next, she was approving budgets that had more zeros than her old bank account balance. But the corporate world had its own language, one even more coded and treacherous than the high society of the gala. While Magnus's support was absolute, others within the company viewed her with suspicion. They saw her as a PR stunt, a pet project. They smiled in meetings, but their eyes were cold. The first real obstacle came not from a spreadsheet or a zoning permit, but from Julian Thorne. His campaign against her was subtle: a death by 1,000 paper cuts. A real estate deal for her flagship cafe location in a prime downtown spot fell through at the last minute. She later learned an anonymous holding company, owned by Nexus Innovations, had swooped in and bought the building for twice its asking price. A glowing feature story, planned in a major tech journal, was suddenly killed. The editor, a friend of Julian's, decided she wasn't a compelling enough subject. Then came the microaggressions, delivered with a polite smile. She ran into Julian at an industry mixer. He approached her, a drink in his hand, his demeanor perfectly pleasant. "Zariah," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, "I must congratulate you. It's a remarkable story. Truly. You have a bravery that I admire." The word hung in the air between them, bravery. It was the word one used for a child, attempting something far beyond their capabilities. He wasn't complimenting her. He was patronizing her, framing her ambition as a foolish, reckless act. "Thank you, Julian," she replied, her own voice just as even. "It doesn't take bravery to accept an opportunity. It just takes being seen as qualified for it." His smile tightened. "Of course. But you must admit, the optics are unique. From server to executive, Magnus is quite the philanthropist. He's always had a soft spot for a compelling narrative. He was painting her as a charity case, a story Magnus had bought, erasing her own agency and intellect from the equation. This wasn't just business rivalry. His hostility felt deeper, more personal. It was the way he looked at her, a contempt that seemed to predate their encounter at the gala. It was the way he'd subtly mentioned the Ninth Ward in a passing comment, a neighborhood she hadn't spoken of publicly. He was digging. Why? What was he looking for? Zariah started her own investigation. She couldn't fight an enemy whose motives she didn't understand. She spent her evenings not in trendy restaurants or networking events, but in digital archives and public records databases. She enlisted the help of a junior analyst on her team, a quiet but brilliant young woman named Anya, who was a wizard with data. "I need you to look into Julian Thorne," Zariah told her in confidence. "Not just Nexus Innovations, his family, his history, anything that might connect him to New Orleans, specifically the Ninth Ward, going back a few decades." Anya nodded, her curiosity piqued. "What are we looking for?" "I don't know," Zariah admitted. "A ghost." Meanwhile, Magnus's support remained a steady, reassuring presence. He checked in on her project, offered strategic advice, and ran interference with the more skeptical members of his board. But his motives remained opaque. Was this purely business, a calculated move to generate good press and simultaneously needle his rival? Or was it something more? She felt a growing, unspoken connection to him, a mutual respect between two people who understood what it was like to operate from a place of quiet observation. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was a piece in his long game, a perfectly chosen pawn. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday night. Zariah was at home, sorting through a box of her grandmother's old belongings, things she hadn't had the heart to touch since her passing. Tucked inside a worn copy of "Their Eyes Were Watching God" was a faded, black-and-white photograph. It showed a younger Naomi, her face bright with optimism, standing in front of a small, tidy storefront. A sign above the door read, "Naomi's Needle and Thread." Next to her stood a smiling man and woman, holding a small boy by the hand. The boy, who looked to be about 7 or 8, was staring at the camera with a serious, almost resentful expression. Zariah's breath caught. She would have recognized that intense, dark-eyed stare anywhere. It was a young Julian Thorne. She immediately scanned the photo and sent it to Anya, along with a frantic message, "Who are the people with my grandmother?" Anya's reply came within the hour. A series of links to old newspaper articles and business filings from the city archives. The man and woman were Arthur and Eleanor Thorne, Julian's parents. The business was a community-focused haberdashery and tailoring shop they had co-owned with Naomi Monroe. It had been their dream, a joint venture between a family with a little capital and a woman with unparalleled skill and a loyal local following. The articles from the first year were full of hope, celebrating the partnership as a model for community revitalization. Then, the tone shifted. There was a story about a fire, a small electrical fire, late one night. That gutted the shop. No one was hurt. But the building was a total loss. They were underinsured. The final article was a brief notice of the business's dissolution and the Thorne family's subsequent bankruptcy. The date was over 30 years ago. Zariah felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This was it. The ghost. This was the source of Julian's poison. She kept digging. She found a transcript from a small claims court dispute filed a year after the fire. Arthur Thorne had sued Naomi Monroe, alleging negligence. He claimed the fire was her fault, that she had left an old sewing machine plugged in. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence. But the accusation was there, in black and white. The Thornes had lost everything, and they had blamed her grandmother. The fight was no longer about a spilled drink or a corporate rivalry. It was about a decades-old wound, a family's ruin, and a legacy of blame that had been passed down from father to son. Julian Thorne didn't just dislike her. He hated her. He hated her because every time he looked at her, he saw the ghost of the woman he believed had destroyed his family. He saw her grandmother's ambition, her grace, her success in the face of adversity, and to him, it was all built on the ashes of his own family's dream. The battle had just become deeply, terrifyingly personal. The discovery changed everything. Julian's attacks were no longer the random malice of a privileged bully. They were the calculated strikes of a man seeking generational revenge. Zariah now understood the depth of his hatred, and it frightened her. He wasn't just trying to sabotage her project. He was trying to erase her, to prove to the world that, like her grandmother, she was a destructive force destined for failure. He escalated his campaign, moving from covert sabotage to overt character assassination. An anonymous article appeared on a fringe financial blog, then was picked up by more mainstream outlets. It painted Zariah as a cunning opportunist who had manufactured the viral moment with Margot Sterling. It hinted at a troubled past and questioned her qualifications, framing the Monroe Initiative as a reckless vanity project funded by a gullible billionaire. The article was filled with veiled classist and racist undertones, portraying her as an unqualified upstart from the wrong side of the tracks. Her face was everywhere again, but this time, the hashtags were cruel. Gallagate, Strata Scam. The supportive comments on her social media were drowned out by a torrent of vitriol. The pressure was immense. The whispers in the hallways at Stratus Tech grew louder. Board members began to express concerns. Zariah felt the walls closing in. She was being pushed to her breaking point, forced to defend not just her own integrity, but the memory of her grandmother. One evening, after a grueling meeting where a senior executive had condescendingly asked her to walk them through her credentials again, she found Magnus waiting for her in her office. The city lights glittered behind him, indifferent and remote. "You don't have to weather this alone," he said, his voice quiet. "This isn't about me anymore." "Magnus," she replied, her voice strained with exhaustion and fury. "He's attacking my grandmother. He's twisting her memory into something ugly." "I know," Magnus said. He knew. The two words hung in the air. Zariah looked at him. A sudden, sharp suspicion piercing through her fatigue. "How much do you know about the Thorns and my grandmother?" Magnus's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension entered his posture. "I know there was a business partnership that ended badly. I know Julian harbors a grudge." "You knew this when you offered me the job," she pressed, her voice rising. "You knew he would come after me like this." "I knew he would see you as a threat," Magnus admitted, his gaze unwavering. "I underestimated the personal nature of his animosity." The cold reality of it settled over her. She wasn't just a promising talent he wanted to nurture. She was a weapon. A perfectly crafted, unknowing weapon he could aim directly at his rival's oldest and deepest wound. Her success would be Julian's ultimate humiliation. He hadn't just backed her. He had deployed her. The realization was a profound betrayal, almost as cutting as Julian's attacks. She felt like a pawn in a chess match she never even knew she was playing. "You used me," she said, the words flat and heavy. "I invested in you," he countered. "And yes, I knew that your success would be a strategic victory for Stratus Tech. The two are not mutually exclusive. The business world is not a pure place. Zariah, but my belief in your vision is real. My admiration for your strength is real." She wanted to rage, to walk away, to tell him to take his capital and his carefully calculated strategies and leave her alone. But where would that leave her? Julian would win. He would have successfully destroyed a second generation of Monroe women. The narrative would be set in stone she was a fraud, and her grandmother was a failure. No, she would not let that happen. She looked at Magnus, her eyes burning with a new, cold fire. "Fine," she said. "You wanted a weapon. You have one. But from now on, I set the terms of engagement." The Stratus Tech Annual Shareholder Summit was the biggest event in the industry's calendar, held in a vast, state-of-the-art convention center. It was a day of slick presentations, optimistic financial projections, and carefully managed Q&A sessions. It was also a stage, and Zariah knew it was the only stage large enough for the final act she had planned. Both Magnus Sterling and Julian Thorne were scheduled to speak on a panel titled "The Future of Corporate Responsibility." It was the perfect, public forum for her confrontation. For weeks, she had worked tirelessly with Anya, digging deeper, unearthing every piece of evidence they could find. They found the original insurance report from the fire, which listed the cause as faulty wiring in the building's main junction box, a pre-existing condition the landlord had failed to fix. They found sworn affidavits from two other tenants in the same building who had complained about electrical issues months before the fire. They found proof that Arthur Thorne had taken out a second, personal loan against the business just weeks before the fire, a loan he defaulted on immediately after. The Thornes hadn't been ruined by Naomi Monroe. They had been ruined by bad wiring and their own desperate financial risks. Zariah secured a seat in the front row of the auditorium, a small, unassuming figure in a sea of dark suits. She listened as the panel began, the men on stage trading polished platitudes about philanthropy and ethical capitalism. Julian Thorne was particularly eloquent, speaking of the need for a level playing field and overcoming historical disadvantages. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, Zariah stood up. A camera found her, projecting her image onto the two giant screens flanking the stage. A murmur went through the crowd. The signing waitress was here. "I don't have a question," Zariah said, her voice steady and clear, amplified by the microphone. "I have a clarification for Mr. Thorne." On stage, Julian's practiced smile froze. Magnus watched her, his face an unreadable mask. "Mr. Thorne, you speak eloquently about corporate responsibility," Zariah continued, her eyes locked on his. So I'd like to talk about a small business that opened over 30 years ago in the Ninth Ward. It was called Naomi's Needle and Thread, a partnership between a skilled seamstress named Naomi Monroe and the Thorne family. Julian's face went pale. He started to speak, to interrupt, but Zariah held up a hand. For 30 years, your family has cultivated a private narrative that this woman, my grandmother, was responsible for the fire that destroyed that business and your family's fortune. A narrative you have used to fuel a personal and professional vendetta against me. She gestured to the large screens. If you could please direct your attention to the screens. On the screens, the images changed from the live feed to scanned documents. The insurance report, its conclusion highlighted in yellow, faulty wiring. The tenant affidavits, the record of Arthur Thorne's defaulted loan. The evidence was irrefutable, laid bare for the entire industry to see. The story your family told was a lie. Mr. Thorne, Zariah said, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. A convenient lie to cover for bad luck and bad decisions. My grandmother was not a villain. She was your scapegoat, and you have spent months trying to make me pay for a debt she never owed. The auditorium was utterly silent. Julian Thorne sat frozen in his chair, his face a ruin of exposed lies. Then, Zariah turned her attention to Magnus. "And to Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its steel. "I want to thank you. You saw talent and you invested in it. You also saw a strategic opportunity to wound a rival using his own history against him. You knew about this vendetta. You didn't tell me, because my authentic shock and pain made for a better story, a more effective weapon." Magnus met her gaze. He didn't flinch. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a confession. "Today, that ends," Zariah declared, her voice resonating with finality. "I am not your weapon. I am not his ghost. I am not your heartwarming PR story. I am the CEO of the Monroe Initiative, a successful, profitable venture in the Stratus Tech portfolio, and I will be treated as such. My victory is not yours to claim, and my history is not his to weaponize. It is mine." She placed the microphone back on its stand and walked back to her seat. The silence held for a beat. And then, from the back of the auditorium, someone began to clap. Then another. And another. The applause grew, a rolling wave of validation that washed over her. She had not only exposed her enemy, she had declared her independence from her savior. She had taken back her own story, in front of the whole world. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Julian Thorne. Nexus Innovations stock plummeted overnight. His board of directors, facing a firestorm of negative press about their CEO's decades-long, baseless vendetta, demanded his resignation. By the end of the week, he was gone, a disgraced footnote in the annals of tech rivalries. Zariah's meeting with Magnus took place in the same sun-drenched atrium where he had first offered her the world. This time, the dynamic was entirely different. She was not the grateful recipient of his charity. She was his equal, a formidable player who had just proven her mastery of the game. "You were right," he said, breaking the silence. "I was calculated. I saw you as an asset, and I leveraged you." "I know," she said. There was no anger left in her voice, only a weary clarity. "The question is, what happens now?" "That is up to you," Magnus replied. "You can walk away. The initiative is structured as its own entity. Your funding is secure. Or you can stay, as a full partner, your voice on the Stratos board, a seat at the table where the real decisions are made." It was a staggering offer. He wasn't trying to placate her. He was acknowledging her power. He was admitting that she was more valuable as an ally than as a pawn. "I stay," she said, without hesitation. "On one condition. We establish a new, independent fund within Stratos, governed by a board that I appoint. Its sole mission will be to invest in entrepreneurs from overlooked communities, people like my grandmother. People like me. No strings attached. No strategic angles. Just belief in human potential." Magnus looked at her, a glimmer of something new in his eyes, not just respect, but genuine admiration. "Done," he said. Their professional relationship was rebuilt on this new foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The unspoken, personal connection between them, once fraught with the imbalance of power, was free to find its own, more authentic level. It was no longer the story of a billionaire and the waitress he saved, but of two complex people who had, against all odds, found a common ground. 6 months later, Zariah stood on a dusty, empty lot in the Ninth Ward. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked concrete. This was where Naomi's needle and thread had once stood. It had been a barren patch of land for over 30 years, a silent testament to a dream deferred. But today, it was not empty. Behind her stood a crowd of people, community members, young entrepreneurs, her team from the cafe, now a thriving, beloved local institution called the Monroe House, and, standing quietly to the side, Magnus and Margot Sterling. In front of her was a podium and a sign that read, "Future Home of the Naomi Monroe Foundation for Community Entrepreneurs." She stepped up to the microphone, not as the woman who had been humiliated at a gala, not as the viral sensation, not as the victor in a corporate war, but as herself, Zariah Monroe, the granddaughter of a brilliant seamstress, a builder. "My grandmother taught me that some things can't be spoken," she began, her hands instinctively beginning to sign as she spoke, a fluid, natural duet of communication. They have to be built. She wanted to build a business here, a place of creativity and community. A fire took the building, but it never touched the dream. She paused, looking out at the hopeful faces in the crowd. "Today, we break ground not just on a new building, but on a new legacy, one that is not about revenge or settling old scores, but about creation, about planting seeds in the soil that others have called barren. This foundation will give capital, mentorship, and a voice to the overlooked, the underestimated, and the unheard." After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and celebrated, Anya handed Zariah a small, lacquered box. "This was dropped off for you, anonymously." Zariah opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single, old-fashioned skeleton key and a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter, the handwriting shaky but elegant. It was from her grandmother. "My dearest Zariah," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means you have found your way back to this place. I left this key with our old lawyer, with instructions to give it to you if you ever came asking about the old shop. It opens a safe deposit box at the Canal Street Bank. There is not much money in it, but there is something I want you to have. I need you to know that I forgive them. The Thorns. They were young and scared, and they lost everything. People in pain look for someone to blame. It is a heavy burden. Blame. Do not let their bitterness become yours. Your hands were made for building, my love, not for holding on to the ashes of the past. Let it go, and build something beautiful." Tears streamed down Zariah's face as she read the words. Her grandmother had known. She had understood, and she had chosen forgiveness over fury. The key felt heavy in her hand. A final gift, a final piece of guidance. She looked up from the letter, her eyes finding Magnus in the crowd. He was watching her, a question in his gaze. She smiled, a true, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. The war was over. The revenge was complete. But the victory, she now understood, was not in the tearing down of Julian Thorne, but in the building up of this place, this hope, this future, finally built on a foundation of grace,